Opened the door to a SWAT raid meant for our downstairs neighbors. They seized my wife's only art iPad and our piece. My wife and I live in the upstairs unit of a duplex here in Minnesota. The two units are totally independent, different house numbers, our own mailboxes, electric meters, and separate front doors, all neatly divided by a shared entryway and garage. About 6 months ago we moved in from out of state, hoping for a quiet new start. I never imagined things would play out the way they did earlier this week. At exactly 7 a.m., I was startled awake by the sudden, silent arrival of multiple police officers and an actual SWAT unit. There were no sirens, just the looming presence of Minneapolis police vehicles blocking off both ends of our street. Before I could even collect my thoughts, I heard splintering wood as they broke down the shared entryway door, quickly followed by the brutal force of them smashing open our downstairs neighbor's front door. Even the man door to our garage wasn't spared. When the dust settled, I found a fresh dent in our car. It wasn't huge, but the damage was there. Upstairs, after the chaos began, our own front door was the only one in the building left intact because I opened it myself. The police were already shouting orders, rifles pointed at us as they told us to come out with our hands raised. My wife and I complied. Before I knew it, our wrists were snugly cuffed behind us and we were escorted outside, rifles never wavering from our faces. For the next 2 hours, we sat handcuffed in the back of a SWAT car, watching officers tear through both apartments. Eventually, a cop uncuffed us, but we still weren't allowed to step out of the car. During those tense hours, I kept trying to explain that we had no connection to the folks downstairs. The police told us the search warrant was for the downstairs unit, street address 50, and kept hammering us with questions. Were we sure we didn't live at 50? Did we know our neighbors? Were our units in any way connected inside? They are not. Over and over, I repeated that we lived upstairs at 48, not 50, and barely even exchanged pleasantries with our neighbors. To make things worse, they repeatedly asked my wife if she was a specific woman from the downstairs unit. She's not, but both my wife and that neighbor are black women. The subtext was hard to miss. As the search raged on, their story began to shift. Suddenly, they said the warrant covered the entire building and the garage. After the search was already complete, they printed a brand new warrant on the spot, this time listing our address upstairs. Only then did anyone hand us paperwork. One of the sergeants approached us, drowning in apologies, insisting this never should have involved us. "You were just caught in the crossfire," he said. Even though the search of our unit wasn't nearly as thorough as what happened to 50, the police did seize one thing: my wife's iPad. What makes this even more infuriating is that the only thing on this iPad is her artwork. She's the only one who even touches it. It's the source of one of our income streams. For whatever reason, they ignored all our other electronics, my own iPad, our laptops, all left untouched. The folks in 50 weren't so lucky. The police took every single electronic device, their cell phones, even their work computers. Reluctantly, my wife signed a document granting them permission to search her iPad. The officers told us that if we didn't, it could take over a month to get it back, and we can't afford to have a main source of income held hostage for that long. At least we got a receipt. We don't own guns. We don't use or sell illicit drugs. We have nothing to hide and live pretty quietly. The worst things in our apartment? Legal weed, some comically dull prop swords, prescription medications, and a couple of perpetually angry cats. All were thankfully left alone. No one was arrested that morning, so I suspect nothing illegal was found, even downstairs. The whole ordeal was overwhelming, terrifying, to be honest, especially with guns in our faces before sunrise. Looking back, I'm kicking myself for not paying closer attention to detail, but in that moment all I could focus on was making sure the police didn't hurt my wife or let our escape artist cat run out the door. Losing feeling in my hands while cuffed behind my back, especially as someone with a disability, didn't help. I was, and still am, in a lot of pain from it all. Now, questions are swirling in my mind. Was this even legal? Can police search both units like this when we're so clearly separated? Is it normal practice for them to just print up a second warrant on the spot after everything is over? Why did they only take my wife's iPad, her lifeblood of artwork, and leave everything else alone? Most urgently, how do we get it back, and how soon can that happen? Do we need a lawyer? We can't afford legal fees, and since neither of us were charged with anything, I have no idea how public defense even works in cases like this. All I know is, everything about that morning haunts me. I keep replaying it in my head, wishing I'd been more prepared, wishing I'd known how to protect my wife and our life from something so unthinkable. Update 1. Oh boy, where do I even begin? If you're looking for a how-to on retrieving your stuff from the police, let me stop you right there. This is not the story for that. Within a week of having our iPad seized, chaos ensued. As if that weren't stressful enough, the week after that, our downstairs neighbors decided that this entire mess was somehow my fault. Suddenly, a smear campaign erupted online. I started receiving texts accusing me of being a disrespectful, animal-abusing wife-beater who uses autism as an excuse to be racist. To this day, I have no idea how or why or when they dreamt up that insanity. Anyone who knows me knows the vibes in our home are the exact opposite of any of that nonsense. Sure, I am autistic, that much is true. I might sound a bit flippant now, but living through all this was incredibly stressful. To make everything worse, our neighbor is a pretty influential person in a specific community we're part of, so things had the potential to get very ugly for us professionally and personally. Thankfully, the fallout wasn't catastrophic, but the tension was unmistakable. And after all that drama, nothing happened. The MPAT never filed their paperwork about the warrant. No one got back to our council member, or our lawyer, or even wth.reddit. The only thing I managed to get my hands on was a redacted copy of the police report from the day they came to our house. That was it. By August I had other pressing matters to deal with as the school year began and I had to return to work. Honestly, I even took a break from pestering the police. I worried provoking them might lead to retaliation, putting my license and all the clearances that let me work with children at risk. Losing my livelihood was simply not an option. Still, I made sure to reach out every month for an update, hoping something would shift. Then, in January, there was finally a sign of life. The opera emailed us. 6 months after everything had started, we did an intake interview with a neutral lawyer. And that was the last I heard from them. With so much happening in the city, I threw myself into protecting my students and neighbors. The sound of a whistle may haunt my nervous system forever. School breaks came and went, but each one got swallowed by manuscript deadlines. There's nothing quite like doing line and copy edits for 10 hours a day to melt your brain. In the meantime, my wife made do with a janky, half-broken Apple Pencil and an equally battered iPad I found buried in the attic, one we'd both completely forgotten about. It was a Gen 7 base, I think? Only 32 GB, so it filled up almost instantly, and my wife's quality had to take a hit due to the drop in resolution. The steady revenue stream dried up a lot, unfortunately, but I figured we'd get our stuff back eventually. Come March, our downstairs neighbors miraculously had their stuff returned to them supposedly. Seeing this, I suggested my wife call the officer who'd originally taken our iPad. Maybe hearing a new voice would change things since I was probably already flagged as a nuisance. 5 days later today the officer calls us back. And let me tell you, I was not prepared for this. Apparently, the iPad had been released from evidence. Back in October. They claimed they didn't have any way to contact my wife. This, despite the fact that they had our address, driver's license numbers, both our phone numbers, and a signed evidence receipt. Oh, and they had also accidentally misspelled my wife's name badly, never mind that they had every possible document with our names spelled correctly. And somehow, even with our lawyer, council member, and QFB all reaching out between October and now, there had been no "hey, come get your stuff, no we're done," nothing. I'm not sure if you know, but they're only supposed to hold released evidence for 60 days. We decided to go to the evidence unit anyway. The officer couldn't even tell my wife the address, but I already knew where it was. I warned my wife, I intended to sit in the evidence unit until they gave us our stuff or had me dragged out. I was just so done. Amazingly, at the evidence unit, everything went off without a hitch. Our iPad was returned, Apple Pencil still engraved, screen intact. Miraculously, they even gave us the case number finally. Only took 10 months. We celebrated with pizza at Beludo and headed home. I refused to connect the iPad to our Wi-Fi until I made sure it wasn't bugged or wiretapped. But as soon as I opened Screen Time, I saw they hadn't even touched it. Whatever. 40 minutes of iOS updates and another 25 minutes of app updates later, and we were finally, officially, back in business. And that's that. It's been a wild ride from start to finish. Update 2. 3 mornings after getting the iPad back, a thick yellow envelope from Hennepin County appeared in our mailbox like a bad magic trick. Subpoena. Not for me to answer for anything, but to testify at a suppression hearing in the downstairs case. My name in block letters, the same gnawing pit in my stomach from that morning back in June. I almost left. I had spent months trying to get anyone to look at our address, now I was legally required to go talk about it. Court was a fluorescent aquarium. We took the elevator up with a fedora guy, a woman with pink hair, and a bailiff carrying a stack of files like a wedding cake. The hallway tasted like metal detectors and old coffee. The downstairs neighbor was there with their lawyer. No eye contact, just two humans sharing a bench and a history. A public defender I'd never met said, "I'm going to ask you about the doors, okay?" Like he was saying, nice weather. When we finally shuffled in, the judge was the kind of calm that makes you sit up straighter. The detective who'd signed the affidavit went first. He talked about a duplex that functions as a single residence and safety concerns and unknown internal access. He used our address and the downstairs address interchangeably like they were nicknames. Then it was my turn. I said our units have separate utility meters. That the garage is shared but the apartments aren't. That there's a literal wall of studs and plaster and dead air between 50 and 48, not an unlocked interior ferry door. I said both front doors have different numbers. I said the first warrant they showed me had only 50 on it. I said we didn't see the one with 48 until after everything was already over and our wrists were going numb. My voice shook exactly twice. I could feel it shake because the microphone was sensitive and expensive. The DA asked if I was certain about the time they handed us the second warrant. I said I was certain about guns at my face before sunrise. The judge raised an eyebrow so high I thought it might leave orbit. The public defender asked the detective to explain the amended warrant. The detective said the word printer and then stopped himself like the noun had bitten him. And then they brought out the body cam. Watching myself on a government TV was the kind of surreal that makes you aware of your own spinal fluid. I watched an officer I'd never seen before step into our shared entryway and say, "We're hitting both to be safe, the garage too." I watched a different officer try to confirm the target address and someone off camera say, "Just print the whole building, we can fix it if we have to." I heard my wife say, from off screen, "This is 48, in the measured, patient voice she uses with my students when they lock themselves in bathroom stalls and pretend they've vanished. I watched a rifle dip as if an apology and then rise again. My favorite line, if you can have a favorite line from the worst day of your adult life, was a younger officer looking at my wife's desk and muttering, "Is this, like, an artist thing?" Before suggesting they take the iPad just in case. Even sitting there, months later, I felt my jaw clench the exact same way. The judge didn't rule right away. He did the judge thing where he said he'd take it under advisement and issued a very polite speech about homes and boundaries and the state needing to live within its paperwork. We went back to the hallway and shared oxygen with our downstairs neighbor for 10 silent minutes until we were all excused, and then we walked out into daylight that somehow felt louder than the courtroom. A week later, the public defender called. The motion was granted. The whole building theory didn't survive the paperwork. Everything they got from downstairs after breaching the shared entryway without specificity was out. The words "dismissed without prejudice" showed up in my email like confetti that might still be on fire. 2 days after that, a U-Haul swallowed the rest of 50's life. When I came home that night, there was a curt little note taped to our ground floor mailbox: "We're leaving. Don't talk about us." No signature, which somehow made it feel polite. On the city's sigh, the machine creaked awake. The opker sent a letter that made me read it 3 times because the word "sustained" appears twice and that word is not a regular visitor to my mailbox. 1 for failure to provide warrant documentation at time of search. 1 for pointing of firearms at compliant occupants beyond initial clearing. Discipline is personnel day and therefore a black hole, so I don't get the end of that story, but the paper had teeth marks in it from me not wanting to let go. The day after that, risk management called like a reformed ghost and offered to cut a check for the dent in our car after previously telling us it was reasonable collateral. The number was so specific it felt made up: $464.37, and I accepted it while looking straight at the dent like I was apologizing. The check is the color of tired wallpaper. Because I am stubborn and because I promised myself I'd be the one who remembers, I also filed a data practices request for the reports and all the body cam footage involving our address. Records made me bring my own thumb drive. The woman at the window said, "You're the duplex," in exactly the tone you'd use if you recognized a minor celebrity from the background of a cereal commercial. The USB they handed back held 3 hours of our living room as a crime scene in a movie I did an audition for. I sat cross-legged on the floor that night, cat staking turn stepping on the space bar, and watched the part where the sergeant told them to print the amendment. He said it like he was ordering a burger. I watched the part where a rookie tried to pet one of our perpetually angry cats and got hissed at so hard he took a step back. That was the first time I laughed out loud. We replaced the lock on the shared entryway ourselves and hung a ridiculous, oversized brass 48 over our door like a talisman against administrative sloppiness. The landlord finally rebuilt the jam they splintered and sent a handyman who tracked sawdust all over the stairs and then apologized profusely to the cats. My wife downloaded all her brushes and textures and lined up commissions like planes on a runway. The first night the Apple Pencil was back in its home groove, I found her asleep on the couch with a finished piece open on the screen, a fox and a field of linen-colored grass. Our cat had camped himself right next to the heat of the glass, and somehow managed to sign his name across the corner, with his paw. She left it. It felt honest. I don't know what to do with the part of my brain that still flinches at 7 am. I don't know what to do with the relief that unknotted something in my belly when the judge said, in his roundabout way, no. But there is a check on the fridge, a new scratch guard on the iPad, OPCR paperwork in a folder like a press leaf, and a front door that closes with a clean, normal click. For now, that'll do. Update 3. 2 Mondays after the OPCR letter, a courier in a neon vest knocked like a woodpecker and handed me a white envelope that hummed with government entity. City Attorney, Risk. We understand you filed. It read like a person trying very hard to be a robot and failing at the pronouns. They wanted to discuss resolution. I wore my best teacher clothes to a conference room with no windows and a thermostat set to museum. The table was too shiny. A carafe of coffee tasted like copier ink. On one side, a woman from Risk with a smile that never blinked, an assistant city attorney with a stack of releases fat enough to be a doorstop. On my side, me, a legal pad I didn't write on, and a part of my spine that still crackles at 7am. They said phrases like no admission and qualified immunity and reasonable force at entry and then slid a number across the table like it might spook. I slid it back. I asked for the locksmith we paid out of pocket, the clinic visit for the wrists I still can't hold a gallon of milk with, the months my wife's commissions fell off a cliff because her studio lived in an evidence locker, the ridiculous brass 48 I bought because paper failed me. And then I said I wanted something that wasn't a check. A piece of paper somewhere that meant the next printer moment didn't happen to the next upstairs neighbor. The lawyer made a little tent with his fingers like a child playing church and said, policy is not part of individual settlements. The Risk woman didn't blink 3 times in a row and then said, we can't talk about training. We did the slow, cautious 2-step you do with skittish animals and municipal budgets. I learned there is a tone of voice reserved for the words roll call bulletin. They went out to check with command and left us alone with the hum of the lights. I pressed both palms flat on the glossy table until I could see my fingerprints as heat. They came back with a number precise enough to tune a piano 15,900 said and $2.11 and a promise so careful it walked itself, an internal training notice on warrants in multi-unit structures. Not a policy, the lawyer said, as if a policy might haunt him at night. A reminder. I said yes. I said it before I could talk myself into holding the thing out for a perfect thing that doesn't exist. 2 weeks later, Records emailed me a PDF that started Operations Notice 24 and 7 and proceeded to say the exact not a policy words in such specific prose it felt like a ghost of what happened to us. Identify unique unit numbers, verify utilities, obtain photos of target doors when feasible, document internal access points rather than assuming. Duplexes, triplexes, accessory dwelling units. It read like common sense wearing a badge. I forwarded it to my wife with a subject line paper that is not a policy but still the break. The check arrived in an envelope thin enough to pretend it wasn't a big deal. Our bank teller said congratulations? With a question mark and then slid us a sucker like I was 12 and brave about a flu shot. I bought a forearm brace that velcros on with the efficient little noise of competence. We picked up a secondhand stool with a footrest so my wife stops wrecking her back, and we finally replaced the janky Apple Pencil with one that magnetically hugs the iPad like it's relieved to be home. Downstairs, life rebooted. A new tenant showed up with a potted plant I had to Google to keep alive. She introduced herself as an overnight nurse and asked, in earnest, is this the right mailbox 450? I pointed at the brass numbers like they were an altar and said, yes. Those matter here. She laughed and then wrote our names on a sticky note and put it on her fridge. The first night, we heard cello practice below us slow scales that sounded like a creek clearing its throat. It was so gentle I almost cried. Because I made myself a promise to be the one who keeps a paper trail, I filed another data practices request for anything to do with Operations Notice 24 SN. A week later, I was standing at the records window again. The clerk recognized me. Duplex, she said, and then, this one short. It was 2 emails and a draft marked up by someone in command who added a sentence about photographic verification to the extent safety permits. I read it like it was a bedtime story and felt something in me not another inch. We did a mediation, too, for the civil rights claim the attorney said lived in our file like a seed. Picture a retired judge in a blazer the color of thunderclouds, 3 bowls of hard candy that had already fused into sculpture, whiteboards no one wrote on. The city's attorney said the word, exposure, like it meant weather. My lawyer who uses the phrase color of law in a way that somehow isn't theatrical kept nudging the conversation back to the part where guns stay up when hands were already down. It was less fireworks than slow math. We settled there, in that room that smelled like felt tip markers and winter coats. I signed my name 5 times and thought about all the signatures that had gotten us to that room. When we walked out, It was snowing, that faint chalk dust that doesn't stick. My wife put her mitten in mine and said, "It's not nothing." The next Saturday, we took a table at an art market in a community center gym with scuffed floors and a banner that read "No tape on the walls." My wife put the Fox the Cat sign piece on a little stand like it was returning to a stage. A woman with pink hair the same shade as the stranger in the courthouse elevator months ago stopped, smiled, and said, "Is that a paw print?" We told the truth. She bought it like she was rescuing a friend and asked if the cat would sign a commission if she brought tuna. Our cat did not negotiate but did sit on the stack of prints like a dragon on treasure the moment we brought them home. Every morning is just a little more boring, which feels like luxury now. The oversized 48 hangs there like a cyclone fence for paper mistakes. The shared entryway door closes with that clean, normal click that still makes me breathe out. The cholo downstairs slides up and down its ladder, scales becoming songs. Sometimes, at exactly 7 am, a garbage truck bangs and the part of me that lives between my shoulder blades does its little electric dance. But more and more, the sound that follows is the kettle, the pencil tapping its post-it rhythm, or my wife laughing at some strange prompt in her commissions queue. Today, a possum in a party hat holding a lemon meringue pie like a trophy. There's a scan of the check in a folder, the not a policy note is printed and tucked into the same envelope as the Opgar letter, a thumb drive labeled body cam that I still keep where I can see it because sometimes proof is as comforting as blankets. I don't have a better ending than that yet. For now, we feed the plant, we learn the nurse's schedule so we don't stomp during sleep hours, and when I hear the cello on its lowest note, I think, that's what relief sounds like if you could bow it. Update 4. The next envelope didn't look like trouble. Plain white, windowed, the kind you'd use to mail a bank statement or a spare social security card, but the return address had that particular St. Paul Gravity, Minnesota post board. I opened it over the sink because I've learned paper can tilt your whole day, and I wanted a drink handy. They were initiating a licensure review and my name wasn't a line about potential witnesses. I had to read it twice to realize it meant the licensing board for cops wanted to hear about the duplex that had lived rent-free in my adrenal system for 10 months. They sent me to a low building off a frontage road where the carpet knows more secrets than any diary. The waiting room chairs were upholstered in a pattern that tried hard not to be noticed. The investigator, middle-aged, tie with tiny boats, offered me water and then used phrases like 6,700%, 1,600% and lack of candor in a voice that could have been ordering a sandwich. He had a printout of the Opgar letter and a USB the size of my thumbnail with our living room on it. He asked me to walk him through the doors one more time, and I did, even the way the rifle dipped like it was apologizing to my wife's patience before it remembered its posture. When I said the word printer, he blinked. I watched him catch himself and write it down anyway. 3 weeks later, another certified letter appeared like the sequel no one greenlit. Notice of hearing. Office of Administrative Hearings, which sounds like detention hall for grown-ups with folders. We took the light rail to keep my shoulders from calcifying in traffic. The building felt like every government building, tall ceiling, quiet HVAC that never shuts up, fake plant in the corner with a cobweb like a veil. A hearing officer in a tie the exact color of the Mississippi in late March asked us to swear, and then the union lawyer took the air in the room, rolled it into a neat ball, and threw it at context. The detective sat across from me in a suit that wanted to be invisible. He did look up when they played the part where he called our house one address. He did look up when the hearing officer used the sentence, "warrants are keys," with very specific teeth. The phrase "failure to exercise diligence" floated through the room like a fly we all agreed not to swat. I answered the same questions I've answered since June, but here they sounded less like disbelief and more like inventory. There was a moment, the only theatrical one, when the union lawyer tried to argue that printing on scene was a form of exigency. The hearing officer leaned back slow, steepled his hands without irony, and said, "Printers do not make emergencies. I will be carrying that sentence around like a smooth stone for the rest of my life. No one tells you that the end of these things comes by email." The subject line was "Board Action Summary." I read it on my phone standing in our kitchen with a spoonful of peanut butter like a cigarette in a black and white movie. They'd issued a stayed suspension and remedial training to the detective for documentation deficiencies and untruthfulness by omission. There was a sentence about mandatory reporting to the county attorney for Brady purposes that made my stomach do the opposite of a backflip. I do not celebrate strangers losing their good days, but I did stand there and feel something slide off a shelf inside me and land where it belonged. My wife looked over my shoulder and said, "Paper." She didn't say, "finally," but it was implied. Because I'm me, I sent another data practices request, not for drama, for corroboration. Radio traffic and CAD logs for the morning in question. Records burn, me a CD, like it was 2007 and said, "duplex," in a kind of fond exhaustion. We sat in the car in front of Minnehaha Falls with the windows open and listened to Our Worst Day on repeat as disembodied voices. Someone said our address correctly. Someone else said, "We're going to do both to be safe," and a third voice muttered, "Just print the whole building, fix it later," like a coffee order they knew they shouldn't be placing. The timecode stamped it in blue numbers that didn't care how my hands felt. My wife reached for the volume and then didn't. On the waveform that night, she sketched a field of line drawing like the one with the fox and layered the peaks of the radio chatter into the grass. She called it duplex. It sounds pretentious to say process art, but there it was, honest and quiet, the sound of authority made visible and then made into something gentler. A reporter from Minpost called after the board summary went public. He said multi-unit structure 5 different ways in 10 minutes and asked if he could quote the operations notice. I said yes and then spent a day warning my inbox not to explode. The story ran with our building cropped at the shared entryway and a pull quote that made me sound calmer than I am. At the farmer's market that weekend, a man in a Carhartt jacket bought a print of the fox with paw signature and said, "I read about your numbers." He meant the brass 48. He told me his mom lives in a basement ado with a door that opens into a hallway that looks like his grandma's, and he keeps the article on his phone like a permission slip. I sold him the print for $10 less than it should have cost because sometimes commerce needs a grace note. 2 days after the article, the precinct's community liaison emailed an invitation to a precinct listening session, which is historically a phrase that can go either way. We went anyway. It was in a gym that smelled exactly like 1,000 dodgeballs and new wax. There were tri-fold poster boards about procedural justice and geography-based patrol and a coffee urn bravely holding its ground. I do not want to overstate anything, there was no standing ovation, no single tear rolling down a badge. But a sergeant with salt and pepper hair who could have been an uncle I don't have came up and said, "We added the door photo thing to roll call." He used the exact phrase from the NADA policy notice to the ESTANT safety permits. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't hand me a ribbon. He just said it like information I was owed. It felt like when you jabble a cabinet that's been sticking 4 months and it finally shuts. Meanwhile, downstairs, the chillo figured out a box suite and we learn the nurse's Tuesday starts at 6 p.m. and ends at 7 a.m. She taped a note inside the entryway, "Please don't ring during days I sleep here, thank you," with a smiley face that is exactly the number of eyelashes that make me trust her. She knocked on our door one afternoon with a lasagna the size of a briefcase and said, "For being quiet on my nights," like we were passing a Thanksgiving side dish between apartments. We ate it for 3 days like a ritual. Because the universe has a sense of humor, our actual printer died during all this. Paper crumpled, gears coughing. The little screen flashed jam in a font so smug I wanted to write a letter to a designer. We went to Axeman on University and bought a used office laser that was probably a backup Singer in a different life. There's a hand-typed tag on it that says "Works, do not drop," which feels like a marriage vow. We printed the board action summary on it, and it slid out clean as a verdict. We stuck it in the same manila folder as the OPCR letter and the NADA policy and the check copy. I am one misplaced fire away from turning into a person who has a fireproof safe. The strangest full circle arrived at the Midtown Farmers Market in the Honey Aisle. A young cop, the one who'd tried to pet our cat on body cam and got hissed back a foot, stood there in a hoodie that made him look 20 and stacked jars of wildflower like a Jenga pro. He recognized the fox print. He recognized me. The look on his face made my chest go weird. He said, "I'm sorry for my part," in a way that did not ask me to do anything with that sentence except let it hit the air. I nodded. I did not absolve. I did not spit. He bought a sticker of the fox and walked away like a person who had to go be a person somewhere else. I told my wife about it and she said, "That's a data point," and I wrote it down. Some mornings, the garbage truck still smashed the curb at 7 and my back does its electric language for 5 seconds. Then the kettle sings, the stool creaks under my wife's knees as she leans into a new commission today, a raccoon in an apron rescuing a souffle, and the cat patrols the sun like a tiny security guard with extremely narrow jurisdiction. We finally mounted a small camera in the shared entryway, not to spy, just a square of proof, a line drawing of who comes and goes. The new printer hums when it wakes up like it's clearing its throat to talk about a better day. The brass 48 shines even in bad light. If you catch it just right, it throws a little bowl onto the opposite wall. I keep stopping to look. Not because I think it protects us, but because it reminds me that sometimes you can staple your address to the world and have it mean something. For us, that's enough to make breakfast taste like breakfast again.